Stakeholders and stakes. So in this section, we're going to go through each of the stakeholders, or each of the primary stakeholders. Owners or financiers, and Freeman seems to think this, that financiers is a better term because when you're a shareholder or a bondholder, you're putting up money for the company and hopefully getting a return. So you're financing it in that sense. In virtue of doing that, you're an owner, but you're not really an owner in the same sense that you own a house or a car. But anyway, owners or financiers clearly have a financial stake in the business in the form of stocks, bonds, and so on, and they expect some kind of financial return from them. Of course, the stakes of financiers will differ by type of owner, preferences for money, moral preferences, and so on, as well as by the type of firm. The shareholders of Google may well want returns as well as be supportive of Google's articulated purpose of do no evil. To the extent that it makes sense to talk about financiers owning the firm, they have a concomitant responsibility for the uses of their property. Employees have their jobs and usually their livelihoods at stake. They often have specialized skills for which there is usually no perfectly elastic market. Okay, so specialized skills for which there is usually no perfectly elastic market. Basically, Freeman means, I think, that once employees have a certain set of skills, there may not exist a lot of flexibility for them in terms of moving from one job to another. Okay, so in return for their labor, they expect security, wages, benefits, and meaningful work. Often employees are expected to participate in the decision-making of the organization, and if the employees are management or senior executives, we see them as shouldering a great deal of responsibility for the conduct of the organization as a whole. And employees are sometimes financiers as well, since many companies have stock ownership plans, and loyal employees who believe in the future of their companies often voluntarily invest. One way to think about the employee relationship is in terms of contracts. Customers and suppliers exchange resources for the products and services of the firm and in return receive the benefits of the products and services. As with financiers and employees, the customer and supplier relationships are enmeshed in ethics. Companies make promises to customers via their advertising, that is, by their advertising, and when products or services don't deliver on these promises, then management has a responsibility to rectify the situation. It is also important to have suppliers who are committed to making a company better. If suppliers find a better, faster, and cheaper way of making critical parts or services, then both supplier and company can win. Of course, some suppliers simply compete on price, but even so, there is a moral element of fairness and transparency to the supplier relationship. Finally, the local community grants the firm the right to build facilities, and in turn, it benefits from the tax base and economic and social contributions of the firm. Companies have a real impact on communities, and being located in a welcoming community helps a company create value for its other stakeholders. In return for the provision of local services, companies are expected to be good citizens, as is any individual person. It should not expose the community to unreasonable hazards in the form of pollution, toxic waste, etc. It should keep whatever commitments it makes to the community and operate in a transparent manner as far as possible. Of course, companies don't have perfect knowledge, but when management discovers some danger or runs afoul of new competition, it is expected to inform and work with local communities to mitigate any negative effects as far as possible. While any business must consist of financiers, customers, suppliers, employees, and communities, it is possible to think about other stakeholders as well. We define stakeholder in a number of ways. Okay, so in this column, we're going to get 2 or 3 definitions of stakeholder. First of all, we could define the term fairly narrowly to capture the idea that any business, large or small, is about creating value for those groups without whose support the business would cease to be viable. The inner circle of Figure 1 depicts this view. Almost every business is concerned at some level with relationships among financiers, customers, suppliers, employees, and communities. We might call these groups primary or definitional. However, it should be noted that as a business starts up, sometimes one particular stakeholder is more important than another. In a new business startup, sometimes there are no suppliers, and paying lots of attention to one or two key customers as well as to the venture capitalist, that is the financier, is the right approach. There is also a somewhat broader definition that captures the idea that if a group or individual can affect a business, then the executives must take that group into consideration in thinking about how to create value. Or a stakeholder is any group or individual that can affect or be affected by the realization of an organization's purpose. Okay, so that would be our third definition. At a minimum, some groups affect primary stakeholders, and we might see these as stakeholders in the outer ring of figure 1 and call them secondary or instrumental. Okay, so just quickly going back to figure 1. So the idea would be, according to one of those definitions, these stakeholders affect and are affected by the firm. And so then what Freeman was saying in the last sentence I read, these groups in the outer ring can affect and be affected by those in the inner ring. So these stakeholders would actually be pretty removed from the firm, but they still have this interactive relationship with what's going on in the inner circle. Okay, there are other definitions that have emerged during the last 30 years, some based on risks and rewards, some based on mutuality of interests, and the debate over finding the one true definition of stakeholder is not likely to end. We prefer a more pragmatic approach of being clear of the purpose of using any of the proposed definitions. Business is a fascinating field of study. There are very few principles and definitions that apply to all businesses all over the world. Furthermore, there are many different ways to run a successful business, or if you like, many different flavors of managing for stakeholders. We see limited usefulness in trying to define one model of business, either based on the shareholder or stakeholder view that works for all businesses everywhere. We see much more value to be gained in examining how the stakes work in the value creation process and the role of the executive. The responsibility of the executive in managing for stakeholders. Executives play a special role in the activity of the business enterprise. On the one hand, they have a stake, like every other employee, in terms of an actual or implied employment contract, and that stake is linked to the stakes of financiers, customers, suppliers, communities, and other employees. In addition, executives are expected to look after the health of the overall enterprise, to keep the varied stakes moving in roughly the same direction, and to keep them in balance. No stakeholder stands alone in the process of value creation. The stakes of each stakeholder group are multifaceted and inherently connected to each other. How could a bondholder recognize any returns without management's paying attention to the stakes of customers or employees? How could customers get the products and services they need without employees and suppliers? How could employees have a decent place to live without communities? Many thinkers see the dominant problem of managing for stakeholders as how to solve the priority problem, or which stakeholders are more important, or how do we make trade-offs among stakeholders. We see this as a secondary issue. First and foremost, we need to see stakeholder interests as joint, as inherently tied together. Seeing stakeholder interests as joint rather than opposed is difficult. It is not always easy to find a way to accommodate all stakeholder interests. It is easier to trade off one versus another. Why not delay spending on new products for customers in order to keep earnings a bit higher? Why not cut employee medical benefits in order to invest in a new inventory control system? Managing for stakeholders suggests that executives try to reframe the questions. How can we invest in new products and create higher earnings? How can we be sure our employees are healthy and happy and are able to work creatively so that we can capture the benefits of new information technology such as inventory control systems? In a recent book reflecting on his experience as CEO of Medtronic, Bill George summarized the managing for stakeholders mindset. Serving all your stakeholders is the best way to produce long-term results and create a growing, prosperous company. Let me be very clear about this. There is no conflict between serving all your stakeholders and providing excellent returns for shareholders. In the long term, it is impossible to have one without the other. However, serving all these stakeholder groups requires disciplined vision and committed leadership. The primary responsibility of the executive is to create as much value as possible for stakeholders. Where stakeholder interests conflict, the executive must find a way to rethink the problems so that these interests can go together, so that even more value can be created for each. If trade-offs have to be made, as often happens in the real world, then the executive must figure out how to make these trade-offs and immediately begin improving the trade-offs for all sides. Managing for stakeholders is about creating as much value as possible for stakeholders without resorting to trade-offs. Okay, so I guess that would be the core principle of Freeman's managing for stakeholders model. We believe that this task is more easily accomplished when a business has a sense of purpose. Furthermore, there are few limits on the kinds of purpose that can drive a business. Walmart may stand for everyday low price. Merck can stand for alleviating human suffering. The point is that if an entrepreneur or an executive can find a purpose that speaks to the hearts and minds of key stakeholders, it is more likely that there will be sustained success. Purpose is complex and inspirational. The Grameen Bank wants to eliminate poverty. Fannie Mae wants to make housing affordable to every income level in society. Tastings, a local restaurant somewhere, wants to bring the taste of really good food and wine to lots of people in the community. And all of these organizations have to generate profits or else they cannot pursue their purposes. Capitalism works because we can pursue our purpose with others. When we coalesce around a big idea or a joint purpose evolves from our day-to-day activities with each other, then great things can happen. To create value for stakeholders, executives must understand that business is fully situated in the realm of humanity. Businesses are human institutions populated by real, live, complex human beings. Stakeholders have names and faces and children. They are not mere placeholders for social roles. As such, matters of ethics are routine when one takes a managing for stakeholders approach. Of course, this should go without saying, but a part of the dominant story about business is that business people are only in it for their own narrowly defined self-interest. One main assumption of the managerial view, with the shareholders at the center, is that shareholders only care about returns and therefore their agents, the managers, should only care about returns. However, this does not fit with either our experiences or our aspirations. In the words of one CEO, the only assets I manage go up and down the elevators every day. Okay, I think that might be the CEO of Costco. We'll see. Most human beings are complicated. Most of us do what we do because we are self-interested and interested in others. Business works in part because of our urge to create things with others and for others. Working on a team or creating a new product or delivery mechanism that makes customers' lives better or happier or more pleasurable all can be contributing factors to why we go to work each day. And this is not to deny the economic incentive of getting a paycheck. The assumption of narrow self-interest is extremely limiting and can be self-reinforcing. People can begin to act in a narrow self-interested way if they believe that is what is expected of them, as some of the scandals such as Enron have shown. We need to be open to a more complex psychology, one any parent finds familiar as they have shepherded the growth and development of their children. Okay, some arguments for managing for stakeholders. Once you say stakeholders are persons, then the ideas of ethics are automatically applicable. However you interpret the idea of stakeholders, you must pay attention to the effects of your actions on others. And something like the responsibility principle suggests that this is a cornerstone of any adequate ethical theory. There are at least three main arguments for adopting a managing for stakeholders approach. Philosophers will see these as connected to the three main approaches to ethical theory that have developed historically. We shall briefly set forth sketches of these arguments and then suggest that there is a more powerful fourth argument. Okay, so first, the argument from consequences. A number of theorists have argued that the main reason that the dominant model of managing for shareholders is a good idea is that it leads to the best consequences for all. Okay, so the best consequences for all, that's going to be utilitarianism or maybe some version of utilitarianism. Typically, these arguments, that is, arguments for managing for shareholders only, invoke Adam Smith's idea of the invisible hand, whereby each business actor pursues her own self-interest and the greatest good of all actually emerges. The problem with this argument is that we now know with modern general equilibrium economics that the argument only works under very specialized conditions that seldom describe the real world. And further, we know that if the economic conditions get very close to those needed to produce the greatest good, there is no guarantee that the greatest good will actually result. Managing for stakeholders may actually produce better consequences for all stakeholders because it recognizes that stakeholder interests are joint. If one stakeholder pursues its interest at the expense of all others, then the others will either withdraw their support or look to create another network of stakeholder value creation. Okay, so that's something we could check if that has happened or does happen frequently or at all. This is not to say that there are not times when one stakeholder will benefit at the expense of others, but if this happens continuously over time, then in a relatively free society, stakeholders will either 1, exit to form a new stakeholder network that satisfies their needs, 2, use the political process to constrain the offending stakeholder, or 3, invent some other form of activity to satisfy their particular needs. Alternatively, if we think about the stakeholders engaged in a series of bargains among themselves, then we would expect that as individual stakeholders recognize their joint interests and make good decisions based on these interests, better consequences would result than if each narrowly pursued their individual self-interests. Now, it may be objected that such approaches ignores the quote-unquote social consequences or consequences to society, and hence that we need a concept of corporate social responsibility to mitigate these effects. This objection is a vestigial limb of the dominant model. Okay, so you should recognize that social consequences or corporate social responsibility is referring back to Freeman. This objection is a vestigial limb, that is a leftover basically, of the dominant model. Since the only effects on that view, the dominant model, were economic effects, then we need to think about social consequences or corporate social responsibility. However, if stakeholder relationships are understood to be fully embedded in morality, then there is no need for an idea like corporate social responsibility. Okay, so the idea here would be, on the one hand, we have Friedman's view, just make money for shareholders. We have the view that Freeman was arguing against, basically run your company and, in some cases, also act on a social responsibility. Freeman is saying that if we're managing for all stakeholders, or the 5 stakeholders that we've been talking about, then we don't need to also think about acting on social responsibility. The executive will be doing everything within his or her power to pursue the morally acceptable objectives. So we can replace it with corporate stakeholder responsibility, which is a dominant feature of managing for stakeholders. The argument from rights. The dominant story gives property rights in the corporation exclusively to shareholders, and the natural consequence arises about the rights of other stakeholders who are affected. One way to understand managing for stakeholders is that it takes this question of rights seriously. If you believe that rights make sense, and further that if one person has a right to X, then all persons have a right to X, it is just much easier to think about these issues using a stakeholder approach. For instance, while shareholders may well have property rights, these rights are not absolute and should not be seen as such. Shareholders may not use their property to abridge the rights of others. For instance, shareholders and their agents, the managers, may not use corporate property to violate the right to life of others. One way to understand managing for stakeholders is that it assumes that stakeholders have some rights. Now, it is notoriously difficult to parse the idea of rights, but if executives take managing for stakeholders seriously, they will automatically think about what is owed to customers, suppliers, employees, financiers, and communities in virtue of their stake and in virtue of their basic humanity. Okay, so for this argument from rights, might be easiest to think about the rights of employees or the rights of people who live in the local community. I mean, the argument can apply to all stakeholders, but there might be certain things that we say as employees or people in the local community, certain human rights that we have that are not perhaps fully covered by our legal rights. But nonetheless, even if a right to clean air or clean water or a right to some warning or some kind of due process before being laid off is a human right that isn't protected by our legal rights, the executive still may have a responsibility to take those rights into account. And so that's naturally going to lead to managing for stakeholders. The argument from character. Okay, so this is going to be virtue ethics. One of the strongest arguments for managing for stakeholders is that it asks executives and entrepreneurs to consider the question of what kind of company they want to create and build. The answer to this question will be in large part an issue of character. Aspiration matters. The business virtues of efficiency, fairness, respect, integrity, keeping commitments, and others are all critical in being successful at creating value for others. Are all critical in being successful at creating value for stakeholders. These virtues are simply absent when we think only about the dominant model and its sole reliance on a narrow economic logic. If we frame the central question of management as how do we create value for shareholders, then the only virtue that emerges is one of loyalty to the interests of shareholders. Okay, so if you recall from What is Ethics Anyway, the idea for virtue ethics is we want to cultivate these different kinds of virtues, and once we've done that, then our actions will simply be the morally acceptable ones because we've internalized these virtues. Okay, so Freeman is saying that if we internalize these virtues, then we're going to be managing for stakeholders. Whereas if we're managing only for shareholders, then we've only internalized this one virtue, loyalty to shareholders, if that is a virtue. Now you might notice that, and this was pointed out to me by a student, a virtue like efficiency, maybe keeping commitments, could very well be part of the managing for shareholders model, depending on how we wanted to fill that out. So there might be more to say here, but in any case, this is what Freeman has in mind. However, if we frame the central question more broadly as how do we create and sustain the creation of value for stakeholders, or how do we get stakeholder interests all going in the same direction, then it is easy to see how many of the other virtues are relevant. Taking a stakeholder approach helps people decide how companies can contribute to their well-being and the kinds of lives they want to lead. By making ethics explicit and building it into the basic way we think about business, we avoid a situation of bad faith and self-deception. Okay, the pragmatist argument. Previous three arguments point out important reasons for adopting a new story about business. Pragmatists want to know how we can live better, how we can create both ourselves and our communities in ways where values such as freedom and solidarity are present in our everyday lives to the maximal extent. While it is sometimes useful to think about consequences, rights, and character in isolation, in reality our lives are richer if we can have a conversation about how to live together better. There is a long tradition of pragmatist ethics dating to philosophers such as William James and John Dewey. That's the beginning of the 20th century. More recently, philosopher Richard Rorty has expressed the pragmatist ideal. Pragmatists hope instead that human beings will come to enjoy more money, more free time, and greater social equality, and also that they will develop more empathy, more ability to put themselves in the shoes of others. We hope that human beings will behave more decently toward one another as their standard of living improves. By building into the very conceptual framework we use to think about business, a concern with freedom, equality, consequences, decency, shared purpose, and paying attention to all of the effects of how we create value for each other, we can make business a human institution and perhaps remake it in a way that sustains us. For the pragmatist, business and capitalism has evolved as a social practice an important one that we use to create value and trade with each other. On this view, first and foremost, business is about collaboration. Of course, in a free society, stakeholders are free to form competing networks, but the fuel for capitalism is our desire to create something of value and to create it for ourselves and others. The spirit of capitalism is the spirit of individual achievement together with the spirit of accomplishing great tasks in collaboration with others. Managing for stakeholders makes this plain so that we can get about the business of creating better selves and better communities. Okay, there we are.